Welcome, everyone. We're surrounded by everybody telling us that we have to move on to hybrid learning. And there's just way too much guidance out there, and most of it I find a little bit too much or a little bit too little. Here I am trying to help you and to start a discussion about with this very simple, straightforward how to hybrid. And I offer you basically 8 decisions that you have to make in 3 steps each. 8 decisions, you make those decisions, you ask your questions. It's basically a magic box where you structure the box using these 8 beams. You put in your questions and pop out the answers. So let's get started. It's as simple as it can get. This is actually going to be part of a book later on, but really, getting books out takes ages and ages and ages. So let's get on with this one. Um, Part one of this is basically showing you the frame, showing you the 8 questions, right? That's the 8 beam hybrid learning framework. We love names. We need names so that you can quote it later on and use it in your workplace, in your school, your university. This is the 8 beam hybrid learning framework. Part two is balancing the seesaw. Part three is 2 by 2, where we apply it and we say, okay, this is how we're going to figure out how we're going to use it. And part four is customizing it. Part one, the 8 beam learning framework. This is what the framework looks like. 8 beam hybrid learning framework. It's essentially basically 8 lines, 8 sets of questions. And each of these questions, if you answer each of them and you plug in your answer into one of those little boxes over there saying, here I am, this is what I choose, this is what I choose, just put your finger on it after thinking it through, obviously, and we'll talk through that. You put your finger on it, you made those 8 choices, your hybrid learning environment is designed. So we start with each of these one by one. The first one, synchronous and asynchronous. Synchronous basically means will all the learning happen at the same time? Asynchronous asks will learning occur at different times? Our second choice, the beam 2, is presence. Will it be physical? Will all the learning require physical presence? If all the learning will require physical presence, you basically fill in all the blocks over there, your modules or your learning cohorts or the courses in your university, whatever it is, with the physical thing. The virtual at the other end of the beam is ask the question: will learning occur virtually in a digital learning spaces only, or only using multimedia? The third beam is about location. Will it be a single hub location? Will learning be in one place only, or can it be in different gathering spots like libraries, learning centers, homework clubs? That's the multi hub approach. Or will it be multi location? Will you have one student in Hong Kong and another student in Singapore and another student in Johannesburg? You could have your teachers sitting in San Francisco, and that's very much part of the hybrid learning environment. Or will it be translocated? Translocation is, of course, the quick and the cutting edge of hybrid learning. And we ask, will learning happen in diverse and multiple locations, or will it be location agnostic? Translocated hybrid learning really doesn't care which location you're in. They don't care to say, it has to work everywhere. Our fourth beam, on one side of the beam, we waited with the question, is it going to be scheduled learning? Will learning be pre scheduled? Or at the other end of the spectrum, we ask, will it be on call? Will learning be on call? Can students have someone responding to their queries when they call, or in a few hours after, or before the next session? So, for example, when teachers and students are on WhatsApp groups together, the students often just tap in a question and the teacher answers as soon as they can, within half an hour, within 3 or 4 hours. Uh, that's on call learning, that's real, and it's happening right now. Peer learning groups, which is another form of hybrid learning, will definitely have on call learning that is provided as part of the environment. Beam 5, rhythm. We're talking about rhythms. At one end of the spectrum, we have routine learning. So, our question to ourselves is, will learning sessions be on a pre arranged routine pattern? Will they be an expected rhythm to our learning. Or at the other end of the spectrum is on demand. Will learning and support be available on demand at the point of need, which is literally just in time learning? Saying adult learning is like that, corporate learning is often like that. When you don't know something, you tap somebody's shoulder and say, can I talk to you for a minute? Can you schedule 15 minutes for me? Can you give me half an hour? I need to learn about this because I have a presentation in 5 days. That's part of a hybrid learning network. On demand learning, that's our fifth beam. Beam 6 is the leadership. And this is not about corporate leadership or administrative leadership. This is about learning leadership. So, where our question on the left is whether it's teacher led, which is the traditional way. Will learning be led by the teacher as per their schedule and arrangements to meet preset goals? Or at the other end of the spectrum, will students lead the learning? Sometimes a very enthusiastic group of students, even in a very traditional setup, do provide a lot of leadership to the learning. It's delightful as a teacher, very rare, but fantastic. But even in other ways, will learning be led by student experience, experimentation, exploration? Will this fit into a framework, or will it be led by a goal? Will it be purpose led or process led? Because for a lot of learning, the Australian cricket team was a great example at one point of time. The process itself is the learning. You take everybody through a process, and it's the student's experience or the learner's experience that leads the learning. It's not preset, or it is not led by the teacher. Beam 7, examination and certification. Uh, at the conservative end, we have the examined learning setup, where we ask the question, will learning be examined formally in addition to regular assessments and the feedback cycle? Or will it be not examined at all, or not even, or maybe it will be assessed, but it will not be certified? Certification as a separate part of the learning cycle is very common these days in many hybrid learning settings, or even online learning settings. And we pretty much have this as our seventh beam, which is about examination and certification. Note here that assessment will definitely happen. You will have all of your formative assessment. You will also have formal assessments. You will have summative assessments, whether they are for each individual module at a time, examined or unexamined modules. Our little squares there could be our modules or the courses in our department. So what is what is our decision for our hybrid learning environment for examinations and certification? And our final eighth beam is about curriculum decisions. Again, at the conservative end of our spectrum, we ask questions like, will learning be determined by a preset curriculum? Does curriculum get designed with context, with standards, or with examination boards in mind? How do you design your curriculum? Who leads? Who decides it? Who's the decision maker here? Or at the other end of the curriculum, which is the holy grail of all true education, we ask the question, will it be autodidactic? Will learning content and pathway be decided by the learner? Will they set their own questions and quests? Our eight beams together form our framework. You'll also notice that above and below are little triangles, and those are our markers asking us the question, where will we be along this beam? Will we tend to the conservative side? Will we tend to the adventurous side? Will it be a bit of this and a bit of that? Hybrid obviously is a mongrel. It is a bit of this and a bit of that. So here we have 8 beams and we make 16 choices. If the terms are new to you right now, just ask. It's there in so many books. I'm happy to help as well. These are the decisions that you make as you design your hybrid learning environment. So these are design decisions. And as you go through this 8 beam framework, aloud, ask yourself the question for each of them. Will it be physical? Will it be virtual? Will it be examined? Will it be not? Will it be routine? And then for each of them, what you're thinking really is, how much of it will be physical or virtual? How much of it will be this or that? And why will it be so? What is the reason for making that choice? Is it about resources? Do you have more resources over here and no resources on the other? Can you find more resources? Is it about Having your capabilities in place? Can you seek training? Do you have support structures to help you actually back up the decision that you make? Do you have the willpower to just pull it through? Because sometimes it just feels a little bit too difficult. And you say, okay, maybe I'll do this in the next cycle. And for now it feels so difficult, even though I know I need to do it in the near future. And the question that all of us in learning should always be asking ourselves, can I learn how to do this? Because the hybrid learning environment is a new thing. And along this, so we ask these questions of how much. And my suggestion is you choose a little bit of everything. Choose a bit of every one of these 16 items over here on the beam, just to try it out, maybe, or just to learn about it. And ask and play mix and match with it. So ask yourself the question, which part of whatever I'm supposed to deliver as curriculum, suppose you already have a curriculum given to you, and just, okay, which parts of my curriculum can I actually deliver only in a single hub? And which parts of the curriculum, really, it doesn't matter where the student is, as long as we are able to create learning engagement. And they're able to feed back to us, and I as a teacher am able to feed back to them, or I as a learner, and I'm able to complete that communication loop so that learning outcomes are achieved. Also, in this grid, everything, while I'm suggesting you do everything, some parts of it are optional. Autodidactic is a little bit adventurous for some of us, especially in the younger years. A PhD student or a postdoc is often not autodidactic. Some of us in lifelong learning, especially those of us who go back to learning just for fun, are happily autodidactic, where they pick and choose their next course, their next bit of learning. The arrows at the bottom are basically saying, please choose your own proportion. It can be all of the left, it can be all of the right, or it can be somewhere in the middle. Part 2 now coming up, saying, how do we choose that proportion? How much? So I suggest a game here, and let's call it the seesaw approach. Since we already have 8 beams, let's start with them one by one. So, using the 8 beam hybrid framework, we choose one beam at a time. So, for example, if we choose beam 2, which at one end of the spectrum has physical and at the other end of the spectrum has virtual learning, the question you are trying to answer is, how much of the course or of the proportion of courses at your college or university absolutely needs for the students and the teachers to meet physically? A bricklaying course, it is possibly a little bit useful for the student and the teacher and the master to be in the same location and actually practicing bricklaying. For a lot of engineering undergraduate work, a lot of natural sciences undergraduate work, one definitely needs students and teachers to be on location, but not for every part of every session, right? There will be components of every session or every learning outcome that will require physical presence, and others that may do well with virtual presence as well. And those are the choices you make. So, for example, the knowledge and the theory part of it, if you're able to create a 15-minute lecture, go for it, because that can only improve or support the physical learning in the laboratory, for example. So, those are the questions you ask yourself. And as you're deciding how much of it can be virtual, there is a whole bunch of questions that you will have to ask simultaneously. Do our students have access? Is data easily available? Is there a device available to everybody? Can they afford it, or can we as an institution afford it? What kind of support systems are in place? Support systems for professors, support systems for students, technical and pedagogical support students. So we need to work out how much of each can meet the learning goals or can increase access to learning. Suppose by going virtual for 60% of our course, we are able to bring in some people with neurodiversity into the learning. That's a win. If you're able to bring in somebody who can't physically come into school or college every day, it's a win, because they can continue learning and they can continue growing. Even if you can impact one student like that, I mean, you're winning the hybrid game already. your when you finally design your beam, it could all look brown. It could be 100% physical the way it used to be decades ago, or it could all look green. It could be all virtual completely, and there are plenty of virtual learning courses. Or it could look somewhere in between, and that's the balance that you seek. So now pretend that this beam, where all the boxes of learning or the modules and the courses that you've put in are the beam of a seesaw. Your question, right, and they have been weighted with all the information that you have figured out so far about what's good for the learning goals, what's good for the students, what our circumstances are, what kind of resources we have. You've already answered all of these questions by now. So now I suggest you pretend it's a seesaw and then figure out that center of gravity, that point in between where the seesaw balances so that it works for you and your circumstances. I am not comfortable with anybody preaching to you that there has to be a specific type of hybrid. Every learning context is completely different, and you have to make those decisions for your learning context, and that's going to work. Otherwise, you're going to be adjusting all the time, and you're going to be force fitting all the time, and that's not easy. Also, having figured out the center of gravity, also figure out whether this needs any support structures to make it workable, and ask, how can I make it better? How can I make it better for myself as an educator? How can I make it better for my students? So that's one by one, and we've done this for one of the eight beams. It needs to be done for each of the eight over here. Now, how do we use them? How do we apply them to build an entire hybrid learning environment? The major decisions are already taken now if you sit and do the beams one by one. But now let's try it two by two. And so that we can build a framework, an institutional framework, and a formal framework for our hybrid learning environment. And two by two, we can work out a lot of things. We can work out solutions such as what lesson elements work for which context, for which of our framework solutions. What structures do we need to build within our institution for our selected hybrid learning environment to work? What skills do we need to pull in or upgrade or build anew to make this hybrid learning environment work? And what roles do we actually transform into or build and place and deploy to be able to actually make this hybrid learning environment work? So, what we've done here is we've taken one example of each of these four lesson elements, structures, skills, and roles by taking two by two of these beams at a time. Let's start with lesson elements. Hybrid lesson elements. Suppose we have synchronous and asynchronous learning. We have decided that we're going to go 50-50 on synchronous and asynchronous. I'm keeping it simple at 50-50 here, your choice entirely. Or and we are going to have both physical and virtual learning. So again, 50-50 over here. So you'll notice the vertical axis is synchronous and asynchronous on top. The horizontal axis is physical and virtual. The same two beams that we saw before are beam 1 and beam 2. Absolutely the same ones, just arranged differently. And because it becomes a 2 by 2, we draw a box in the middle and we look at each of these boxes. The traditional one, physical synchronous learning, lecture, discussion, explanation, what we've been doing for the past 40-50 years in a classroom. That's traditional. Suppose we have synchronous and virtual learning. That's our box on the right at the bottom. We could have a webinar. We could have an interactive quiz. We could have lesson elements such as a live chat room where everybody is talking to each other, or a shared blackboard where everybody is talking to each other. Even though they're in virtual spaces, they will deploy synchronicity. They will all work in the same time on a virtual blackboard. Our third option going up now to the left is asynchronous learning, but in a physical space. And we've also been doing that. We're very good at synchronous spaces. We've been doing that for a long time. And that will involve projects. Our traditional asynchronous learning has always been homework, where we have retrieval learning happening in homework, or we reprise, our students to reprise and revise everything that they have learned at school. Written feedback is a great example of asynchronous and physical learning, where students and teachers give each other feedback in the form of either formative assessment or just notes that they write to each other. You could have fun sketches going back and forth. There are different ways of feedback, and they all happen in the physical space, but they do not necessarily happen to have to be in the same time at all. The fourth, and possibly the newest part of this straightforward hybrid element, is virtual and asynchronous. Now, this works and has been used in corporate training for the longest time. In schools, it has been used much less. And as you For younger students, often it becomes more and more challenging to design pedagogies for this. But what works really well are recordings. You can set up an asynchronous blog debate where somebody sets off a trigger note and then the students comment on it. Or you can have even email feedback where you have feedback loops that are set up where you discuss a certain issue or a project where you're giving feedback to each other. That doesn't happen to be in the same time. You could send me an email at 6 p.m. and I might respond at 9 a.m. the next morning. It doesn't happen to be in the same time, but it's in virtual space, and there is definite learning happening with engagement, with improvement in outcomes, etc. So there are very many more that you can fill in over here. These are examples. Let's move on to structures. How can we use our 8 beams, 2 by 2, to identify hybrid learning structures that we need to create or nurture in our hybrid learning environment? This time we take 2 beams that are scheduled and on demand and on call. So we can either have routine. On our vertical axis, we have routine, and on demand. On our horizontal axis, we place scheduled and on call. So you can just bung any 2 of the beams together and figure out what's going to happen. We'll talk about that. Here we've done routines and schedules, whether it's on demand or on call. So if it's routine and on schedule, we used to call it a timetable. It's a traditional class. You could have a revision session. That's the way we've been doing it so far. Routine and scheduled learning in our school systems. We could also, going to the right, have routine and on call. So you could have drop-in centers, and that's a part of the routine of your university, possibly. Or you could even have a chatbot, right? So you could have a chatbot that is routinely available 24 hours a day, but whenever the student requires it on call, that chatbot is available to answer queries about their learning. Going up on the left, you could have on demand but scheduled sessions. So you could have a student learning center where tutorials are part of an on-demand thing where students drop in. They can ask questions of teachers or para-teachers or senior students who are running the student learning center. Professors often have office hours. That's part of this kind of a hybrid learning structure where it is outside of the classroom. You could also have virtual elements put into it, but that's a third beam. We're bringing in a third beam into that. So what we note is we can actually combine more beams than 2. But at this point of time, we're just doing 2 by 2s. But do feel free to keep combining more and more beams and saying, what happens if I add that? What happens if I add that? That's how you're going to design richer hybrid learning structures. Don't wait at only 2 over here. Now for skills, how do we figure out our skills? Let's take another set of 2 beams. We're taking 2 by 2 just because it's easy for us to start off on it again. Suppose, and this time it's not a 2 by 2, this time it's actually a 3 by 3. So we're talking about locations, and we are talking about the learning leadership over here for the learning session or for the learning interaction. It's again not grand administrative leadership or corporate leadership. We are talking purely about learning leadership. Who's going to run the session? Who's going to drive the direction of of that learning engagement that we have? So on our vertical axis, we have 3 parts over here. It could be supervisor led, it could be teacher led, it could be student led, right? And on our horizontal axis, we recognize the location bits that we already spoke of in our 8 beam framework. It could be a single hub, it could be a multi-hub like a community hub situation, it could be a multi-location situation, or it could be a translocated, which means location agnostic learning setup that we are trying to create, our hybrid. So now starting from the bottom left, if it is supervisor led and in a single hub, You could even have a para teacher over there, somebody who can hold the fort. Often we even leave senior students in charge of the room. Professors at large universities and very prestigious universities will often have teaching assistants who will actually run the session. Somebody who can hold the fort, because it's a single hub and the supervisor takes care of most situations. If it's a multi hub situation, what are the skills that we require? The skills that we require is somebody who can support and direct the query, right? So if you have a community hub and the teacher sitting over there who may or may not be an expert in the query that pops up, they should be able to support the query. They should be able to validate the query. They should be able to validate the student and say, yes, we will come back to you. This is a good question, and direct it in the right place and make sure the student gets the kind of learning support that they need. Uh, Going to the right, if the same thing happens in multi-location things, and you only have a supervisor over there in charge, and you don't actually have the professor on site all the time across managing the multi-locations, obviously you cannot. Then you need virtual logistics skills. Somebody has to set up the virtual logistics skills. That's technology in action over here, and we need to call for those skills to work and build our hybrid learning environment. If it's translocation, then we definitely need to pull in platform building skills, because personalized attention is something that everybody is going to require, but that does not necessarily mean that the professor, the subject expert, or the content expert is required to be on call all the time. That is not possible. You definitely need a platform on which the expert or the professor and the teacher will contribute over here. This going up along, say, for a teacher-led thing and a single hub, it's traditional pedagogy. We need traditional pedagogical skills. We also need a lot of paperwork skills. The student in a traditional setup with a single hub or even a multi hub situation needs to be able to deliver on the job. They need to show up to class, they need to be able to engage in the class, they need to conform and socialize themselves to the workings of the class so that everybody can work comfortably together. And they also need to have a sense of followership, because you're following the curriculum and the social norms and the learning norms that have been set for the cohort. Whereas in a multi hub situation for the student, they literally need to turn up. They need to keep turning up. So their time management skills are important. Their spatial skills are important. I mean, we've all seen teenage students and they just don't seem to land up at the right place at the right time. So knowing what they can get from which resource is really, really important. And so when you enter into a multi-hub or a multi-location thing, they like the choices. They will engage, if not in one place, then in another place. And the engagement will go up. But we do need to work on their spatial skills to help them understand, okay, for this you can go here or you can go there, and make sure that that engagement works. So that's actually skilling up the student over there. The teacher-led multi-location thing will require multi-channel connects, or will require skills for multi-directional learning, because as teachers traditionally we were taught to just speak, as I am just speaking right now into the ether, and that's not really good enough. That's only a starting point. And this is why I hope this is only a starting point of our hybrid learning discussion, because there's a lot more going to come after that, and I'm hoping there are more discussions that we build on this. Teachers who are going to manage multi location or translocate in hybrid learning environments will need to work in relay teams. They need to be able to hand over to each other. For a subject expert professor, for ivory tower professors, that's going to be incredibly difficult, and obviously each of them is a unique type of expert. So relay teams are not exactly what they do, but then you have to recognize that they already do relay teams with their TAs, right? The TAs are relay teaming each other and they're leading the relay teams. So in one form or the other, relay team skills are going to become really important for multi-location, and they could be happening at the same time and in different locations. So we haven't brought in the time variable into this. We could easily. One huge skill that we will all have to learn is that of disrupted continuity. Relay teams, for example, are literally about passing the baton on. But if it's not synchronous learning, suppose it's asynchronous and multi-location and you're running a relay team, it's okay for the continuity to be disrupted as long as the content momentum is fine. And that's a whole skill set that we have to build. We don't really, in our traditional setup, we don't have these skills just yet. So disrupted continuity is something that we will have to build. This is just showcasing how we can use the 8 beam framework two at a time to identify skills that we will require for whatever we build, whatever hybrid learning environment choices we have made along our 8 beams. Skills are not roles. Let's figure out next our next example of how we use hybrid learning beams to identify what roles we will need to do. We chose the other two beams. So this way we've basically covered all the 8 beams. And the conservative one is on the left vertically is curriculum and autodidactic. The conservative one is closer to the origin, as is sort of logical in our heads. On the horizontal axis, we have examined versus right out there is uncertified, possibly even unexamined. You don't need, every learning doesn't need to be examined at all. And we put these together and we realize one thing, that the curriculum led examined system, which is basic essential learning, all foundational learning, all elementary learning, the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, basic analysis of an understanding of the world. All of these fall into this essential category. And the roles that our educators have to perform over there are that of an administrator and that of a compliance tracker. Have you figured it out? Do you know your 2 times table? Have you complied with the curriculum? Have you complied with the examination requirements? Have you met the standards? Are you at level 3 or are you at level 4? Are you in class 5, so you should be at level 5, but really your reading level is level 2? Our role as educators in the traditional thing becomes administration and compliance tracking. We have called it teaching so far, but we are also talking about different roles that the teaching creates. You will note the word facilitator does not pop up in any of these boxes. I hope you're smiling as much as I am over here. Going up on the left, autodidactic and examined. Suppose you have a student who says, I want to take examinations, but I'm going to pick and choose my examinations. Now, this already happens, for example, in the IT arena, where every couple of years everybody has to say, okay, I'm going to certify myself as this, or I'm going to certify myself as that. Not taking any brand names over here. And then you sign up for certification. Now, this is really important to progress. And it can actually be introduced at early levels at school. I mean, children sign up for maths Olympiads or they sign up for the spelling bee. And that's often autodidactic learning, but it is clearly examined and even certified. And in that, the role of the educator becomes that of the controller or the corraler, saying, I'm going to pull all the resources together. This is not curation. I'm going to pull you together again and again back to your goal, saying, okay, this is what the certification requires. I know this is the adventurous part of it, but if you want to take part in this competition, that is about designing a new future, or this global Prince X's award over there. So somebody will need to help the student corral all their resources, otherwise they will go all over the place. So you need boundary conditions to be set for this, and somebody to say, I am the controller over here, as supportive, not bossy, right? And this is how we're going to do this. This is how we're going to make sure that you win that competition, or are able to put a decent effort into your submission for the competition. This is something that would also happen in, say, undergraduate consultancy courses. If you're teaching somebody to be a consultant and there's an undergraduate course for that, and there are quite a few diplomas and undergraduate courses starting up for the field of consultancy, this would be an excellent approach to such a course. This is also an amazing approach between middle school and high school for a very small proportion of learning, where you help students identify their abilities, talents, potential, because you will be able to find a spark, or they will be able to find their interest, or even build capability sets by using this approach. That's why it's a very important part of the learning process, and you will have to design hybrids for it. The traditional setup doesn't do that. Going to the right, you have an uncertified or possibly unexamined course, but in with traditional curricula. So, for example, if I suddenly want to train myself in philosophy, but I cannot be bothered to do an exam, I'm not really not going to go through that all over again. I will pick up the curriculum from a fantastic course at Oxford or Harvard, because they're amazing places for philosophy, among other places, of course. And I will say, I'm going to work on this value added Uh, aspect of learning, and what I would really appreciate the educator do in this, and that's what I would sign up for if I would, and in a hybrid learning environment, is to have somebody who guides me towards destinations, saying, okay, this is where you can go for further learning, this is where you can go for certification, this is where you can go and even do a job, or TA for a professor for a while, because when you teach you learn a lot more. Or this is where you can help somebody write a book about what you're learning. What is the destination? So the educator becomes more a guide to saying, these are the destinations, this is where it will lead you. This aspect of learning will lead you here, that aspect of learning will lead you there. Also, classically, a placement manager. You need somebody to say, okay, this certificate, this learning is going to MOOCs, were a great example. This learning will get you a job here. Here is how I can help you get a job, because I know you have learned this stuff, and I know this is where it's going to be useful to X organization. And finally, the holy grail of dream learning, or the dream situation in learning for many of us, especially from the student perspective, is when it's autodidactic and unexamined and uncertified. You are in student heaven, you can do what you please. And so, what is the role of the educator out here? The role of the educator becomes absolutely critical here. Not just essential, not just important, not just value added, but critical, because this is where the educator has to curate both the pathway, the content, and the engagement triggers for the student. There's a huge amount of curation that is happening. It's nudge, 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 nudge all the time. It's motivation, inspiration all the time. And the educator becomes basically a critical path manager, so that the student manages to achieve certain levels and dimensions in their learning that are of use to and satisfaction to themselves going forward. So that's how we use these to identify roles, skills, structures, and in the hybrid learning environment that we make. So using these beams, look at the framework that we've built. We put two beams together, we figured out rules. We put another two beams together, we figured out the rules. So literally, like building a house, if you're able to put more and more beams together, and you look at the intersections of what these choices that you made in the first section imply, your answers will pop out. So how do you do it for yourself? Our next section is customize it. Now here we are simplifying a little bit, so you're going to um, enjoy this a little bit more, I think. So first, you take two of these beams, one by one, and make your choices. This is the step by step for what we've already been talking about. Put one on the vertical, put one on the horizontal, and then put a cross between them. So you have four boxes, two by two. Why do we have a 2 by 2? Because in our beams, we made two choices, to made two sections. One on the left, the conservative choice, one on the right, the new choice, is the way we structured it currently. Um, so the 8 beam framework lends itself to a 2 by 2 when you take two of them at a time. 2 times 2 is 4. So that's our first step. Um, then what we do is rather, that's not our first step. Step one is take each step one, two, three, and four. Here we have our 2 by 2. Step five is now you ask your question. We asked four sets of questions previously. We asked the question about what roles do we need? What skills do we need? What structures will we need to put in place? What lesson elements? Those were the four questions we already asked and answered. But there are so many other questions that we need to answer in actually creating a working hybrid learning environment. We want to ask questions like, what pedagogy should we use for this set of choices that we have made? What teacher training are we going to require? What leadership skills? What data gathering can we do? What are our impact metrics? What should our KRIs be? How will we create student engagement? There's a whole bunch of questions that can pop up. And again, you can use the 8 beam framework preferably two at a time to start with, and then add complexity by adding one more beam at a time, or choosing the right beam to add to that framework, and then looking at the intersections. So here, suppose we choose the question, uh, and then you have to fill in the boxes with your answers. So you ask the question and then build the intersection, saying, okay, if it's this and this, then what do we do with it? So bring your questions and your framework together. And that is your summarized 6 steps for customizing it. But it doesn't work. As a teacher, I would not be satisfied if I could not give an active example of how it's done. We demonstrated how it was done with the 4 examples, but let's do it once with a new question. So, if your question is, how do I improve student learning outcomes with a combination of multiple locations and multiple times? Well, that's the core of hybrid, right? Where you have multiple locations and you have multiple times, and you say, thank goodness we have digital, and thank goodness we have gardens, and thank goodness we have good weathers, so that we can create a hodgepodge but an organized, structured mongrel of a hybrid learning environment. So let's start with step 1 and 2, which is about choosing our 2 beams. Our question has this, right? Our question says different times. So we put it on the left, your vertical axis. And beam 1 for us, synchronous and asynchronous learning, was about time. So we put that there. About locations, we had another beam which was about single hub, multi-location, or translocated. We put that there, right? That's our first 2 steps down. Step 3 and 4, we draw our lines in between. So we have our 2 by 2 in place. Step 5, ask your question. We started with the question, how do I improve student learning outcomes with a combination of locations and times? So here we are. We have our grid and we have 4 boxes that we need to fill with our answers. So with the choices that you have made for your context, you say, okay, I have chosen that these 3 topics or these 3 learning outcomes will have to be done in a single hub. I can do this one completely online, so I don't care what location they're in. So these 2 topics or learning outcomes can be done over completely in a translocation format, and those can be asynchronous. But one of them actually has to be synchronous. I need all of them together, even if it's an online space. So we've made those decisions and we plonk those in to the patchy into the boxes that we have on our axis. And then for our circumstances, we fill in the blanks over here in these 4 boxes. Not stopping here, because every good teacher always wants to give sample answers too. Uh, it reassures us that communication has happened, and I will happily wait for questions on this. So, step 6, fill the 4 boxes with your answers. And this is specifically now what's our goal here? What did we add over here? The question. The question was, how do I improve student outcomes? In our diagram, we've already drawn in the other parts of the question, but we haven't drawn in the outcomes. So the answers have to be about the outcomes. So in a traditional single hub setup, we can say you set up a class with a timetable and a subject teacher and with revision sessions. That's how we've been doing it traditionally, right? We set up the session with an experienced teacher. The teacher gets teacher training. There's a specific pedagogy. There are certain learning tools that the teacher uses. We choose pedagogies based on evidence of outcomes, saying, when the last time I taught the water cycle, uh, this particular approach worked. And in 15 other schools, they ran this research and they said the water cycle is best taught by using XYZ retrieval practice. And so I will use that retrieval practice. So that is how you design for improving outcomes in a traditional setup. Now, going up and to the left over here, suppose you have asynchronous and single or community hub settings, then how will you design it? Well, you'll probably create a drop in study center with a teacher in charge of the center, and make sure that the materials there are absolutely brilliant. This is where you'll have to focus on materials. So even if the teacher is not an expert in that particular subject, so you have a maths teacher, but somebody drops in with a science question, and they know what to do, but they're not totally the experts. They don't do it all the time. They should have access to great materials where they can support and suggest. Remember the skills we popped in over there? Where they can support and suggest and say, hang on, leave your question with me. And in the meantime, here are these 5 resources that you can look at. So these are materials with outcome focus. You can also make it a practice test center. Remember, our question was about outcomes. So the drop in center is a great place to have practice tests. Come in, do a practice test. Especially for those who don't test well and they're very nervous about testing. You test yourself 100 times, you just get to you're used to it most of the time if you're supported well. Again, skill up the teachers in that. So your answers are popping up just because of the structure we have created. Moving to the right at the bottom over here, suppose you have a multi-location or a translocation setup which is synchronous. How are you going to design that? Well, if you have multiple locations, but all of them have to be taught at the same time, it would be amazing to have a star teacher. Put your best teacher out there to teach the core of it. And that's what's going to create brilliant engagement. And then people are going to absolutely understand it. And then, of course, supplement it with team teaching, supplement it with materials. So, creates, but in that moment, create student live discussions to keep it synchronous. Create group work with very explicit outcomes. Multi-location, it's very easy for it to get dissipated as well. It's very easy for people to say, oh, I was in the wrong time zone, I thought this wasn't it was 5 p.m. This standard time and not that standard time. We need to be fairly explicit about that. That's part of the administrative design of this particular hybrid learning environment. Suppose you have a hybrid learning environment, the fourth option over here, where it's asynchronous and translocational. It doesn't matter where people are, it doesn't matter what time they pop in to learn. So what kind of a hybrid learning environment do we set up over here to create improved learning outcomes? Remember, it's for this goal. If our goal was to create equity, we would have a different answer over here. If our goal was to create inclusion, we would have a different answer here. If our goal was to create larger number of students or revenue, that would have a different answer. Our question here specifically was, how do I improve student learning outcomes with a combination of locations and times? And the answer over here that I'm suggesting in the small space that I have, this could become a 20-page note in itself, is, for example, you have 24/7 managed portal, right? So you create a portal, you design a portal, so anybody can pop in, anybody can listen to a lecture, anybody can do the interactive questions that you design in that. You have a lot of resource materials, videos, games within that. You have self assessments. You have peer drop in sessions, and you create mentor tutor support so that you have one on one synchronous engagement, or even asynchronous engagement via email, etc., going back and forth, but some connect. For at least 5 to 10% of that cost. So, that hybrid learning environment will have to be designed in that way. So, that's how we use all of these beams to connect with our objectives, to be able to design our structures and to be able to answer all the questions of how do we do this. This is literally a how do we do this. So finally, in summary, this is what our decision dashboard is going to look like. With all our decisions over here, you just put in your markers, you mark in your X somewhere along this. There are two approaches. I'm winding up now, summarizing it. There are two ways you can approach the grid. One, you can uh, first start by combining the eight beams and then ask the questions. Or you can start with the questions and then build with the beams. We have gone through both approaches so far. So you can, and this is a page you have already seen before, you can start by saying, okay, here is beam 1, here is beam 2, here is beam 3, here is beam 7. Let's put them together and let's see what answers we get for our it's a bit like a tarot card game, really. Let's see what answers we get for our learning environment, because by this time you've already done the brain work for this. You've already figured out what works and what doesn't work. You've already worked on your mental models and said, I'm going to try something new, I'm going to learn something new over here. So just play around with these beams as if these were cards and see what answers you can arrive at by stretching this. Or the other approach is, you start with a question and then you say, okay, this question means, this question has three keywords. It has outcomes, it has locations, and times. So one of our beams has locations, plonk the location beam there. Another of our beams has times, plonk the times beam there with synchronous. And then ask the question for each of the grids and say, okay, how do we answer this for outcomes? How do we answer this for outcomes, etc. That's how we do it. Eight beams, utterly simple. All it is simply these eight sets of questions. Whether and your X marks the spot where you have made a choice saying, this is what I'm going to do for myself. Thank you so much. I hope it's been useful. I'm at Meeta Sengupta on Twitter, which is the fastest way of getting to me. This is going to go into a book, but as I said, the book is going to take so long to write and publish that I wanted to be able to help you, saying, design your hybrid learning environment. I know you have deadlines, you have to be able to present something to your board. Uh, Use this 8 beam framework, and I hope it's going to work for you beautifully. Thank you so much.